This week we discussed learning theories and the brain and cognitive functioning. And there were just two questions, but as many of you noted, they were complex, probably because learning is a complex behavior. I asked you to take a look at Exhibit 2.1 in the chapter, and after you read those different learning theories, to kind of discuss where you think you best fit in terms of the way learning theory is maybe played out in your actual experience, both perhaps as a teacher, as a learner. And some of you commented on that. Some of you commented on the fact that, man, I really, as a learner, I really see myself this way, but as a teacher, I'm presenting it this way. And that presented a dichotomy that some of you really had some deep personal reflection on, which is hopefully what this is all about, and a discussion, a bit of reflective theory, learning theory here, in that we really learn most when we reflect on our own experiences. And then I asked you to take the PAE, the Philosophy of Adult Education inventory, which was really linked to what you saw in the text. So in the text in 2.1, if I can pull this on over here, you saw things like when your belief is that the locus of learning is, what is that locus of learning, how it really is nestled in terms of the theory of the way a person learns. You read these comments, and then this talked about where that might fit. Same with when you identify a purpose of education, producing change or desired direction, talked about kind of where this fit. And many of you commented about where you fit here as being a little bit more cut and dry than what you found when you took your interest inventory. So I decided to take this interest inventory again, as I've done. I've taken it last year and I took it again this year. So is this year's? Yes. So when I took it just day before yesterday, I found myself in this area of pretty even, not so radical. I'm not really that much in for social change. Interestingly enough, this is an emerging area where social change, it's talked about when we get to discussing different generations. This is one of the millennial areas that they are really all about social change, and so they're using a lot of social media for their learning. Another topic, another day. But humanistic, progressive, behaviorist, and liberal, they're all pretty even. In fact, liberal went up just a little bit and behaviorist went down. And I decided, well, I better check that with last year's, because some of you asked about, is it setting? Is it what's in our minds right now? And yes, that's the problem with self-reported data. Oftentimes it's a bit of a moving target, especially if it's self-reporting data that is related to your emotions. And I think in one of the discussions, it was Corey who talked about one of his students who came from a kind of a tougher learning situation or a tougher home life. And so that their emotions really changed how they were engaging in the classroom. So yes, I think that that does make a difference. And this is my last year. So liberal, behaviorist, somewhat close, and then progressive, and then humanist and radical, which stayed about the same. So progressive was much higher a year ago than the liberal way. So the liberal education for intellectual development versus education for practical problem solving. And it probably just meant that I answered a couple of the questions differently than I did last year. And in fact, I think most of you can probably see how some of these questions, I'll bring this back over, were formulated basically from these types of topics right here. All right, that all being said, let's take a look at some of the questions. And as I've mentioned before, when I pull the questions out of the groups, I usually find one person who maybe has asked the question that several of you have asked, and then just showcase that. But most of these questions were asked, or these items were discussed and emerged as themes throughout the 5 groups. But in group 3, if I scroll down here a little bit, she says she's a little confounded by her PAEI results. If the scores are close together and spread over 3 or more philosophies, some careful examination of your beliefs and how you answered the questions is recommended. I would ask that question of myself then. If your scores are close together, then you should complete the questionnaire again, as you may be answering the questions as you would like and not as you are. And I think this is her first question. As you may be answering the questions as you would like and not as you are. I think this might be because some of us are coming from varied backgrounds, varied experiences, and we're not teaching in a way that is concrete for an exact situation. So, in the case of Haley and a few others of you who might not be in the classroom at this time, you are connecting your thoughts about learning to a variety of experiences and not just one tangible experience as some of you have in the classroom. In my case, I am also teaching over a variety of areas. I am teaching a CTE and STEM, which is very progressive. It is completely constructivist type of thing. I'm not teaching it in a way that is behaviorist, and other than there are grades because it's a formal setting. And then I switched to a course like this where we're really looking at theory. So that might be education for intellectual development. So I think that sometimes it's really what's our experience and how varied is our experience at the moment when we take this type of an inventory. So I hope that helps you understand why you might have these confounding. And at that, my look at this, as some of you really were really tightly felt like your bar was very high. I think it was Tasha, I'll bring this back, who said that her humanistic score was way up here, and it was Kari that said her behaviorist and a few others were way up here and others were quite a bit lower. Maybe not quite a bit lower, but lower. And others said progressive was much higher and liberal and radical was quite a bit lower. It is because you might be having a teaching experience that is in a particular setting with a particular audience those strategies associated with that learning theory work. And so that's my response to this question, and for some of you who had the same question. Must we strongly align with one or two learning philosophies? Can we accept philosophies circumstantially? Well, I think I've answered that with only one or two learning philosophies. No, I think if you're teaching a class on critical thinking and learning theories, like we are discussing this week, that requires education for intellectual development and a different approach to the way we are thinking about, in this case, learning sciences versus teaching somebody to weld, or as Jonathan put out, culinary arts, where there's an exact expectation to be able to have a certain skill. So I think that, no, we don't need to strongly align. And again, I'm going to get back to why this is a complex behavior here in just a moment. But I think you can begin to see that setting, the content that you have, when I say setting, whether it's formal, non-formal, the context of which the learners are coming in are definitely important things we have to think about. With these two questions considered, should I retake it? No, absolutely not. And I hope you didn't do that. A few of you asked that, and I already shared with you what mine looked like 12 months apart. And as a sum up, we had a number of progressives in the class. Some of you wanted to know if most of the CTE folks were in that camp. Yes, but I would also mention that most of you who were in either a secondary setting with high school and middle school students, most of you also had very high behaviorist scores that you reported. And some of you also in the ATC, Kari and Jonathan, where you have also specific skills that you're checking off, competency-based kinds of things. Behaviorist was one of yours. Again, I think it goes back to the setting and some of the age groups that you have. Tasha, I think, was the one with the very high humanist score, and it goes back to the settings that she works in and the content that she's working with. So theories confounding within ourselves. This is one that there was a conversation between Jacob Christensen and Jacob Hendrickson, so I want to address this. Although theories confounding, I think that you're beginning to see that they're not really confounding. It's just that we find ourselves in these different situations, and that's why in chapter 1 we talked about setting. All of you do not have work with adults. Some of you are working with high school and middle school students. So sometimes I'm seeing it is hard for you to transition because it's not your experience, and that's okay. But this was really asking you to take a look at it in terms of an adult teaching situation. Those of you who are working as the dietitians and working strictly with adult education, you had a different experience because you are oftentimes, well, you are working in what I would consider a post-secondary or in a non-formal adult education setting. So your comments are we're different, and that's why I like to see these mixed up groups that we have each week in discussion. So Jacob Hendrickson said this: I find it interesting that we all agree with different theories that seem most accurate for how people learn. I think it's because each of us in this course is learning for a different purpose, and each of us is used to teaching for a different audience. Yes. Let's see, Jacob, you are the landscape architect, I believe. In your response, you said to think that what do you think is the most effective method for learning our progressive and humanist approaches? He's talking to Jacob Christensen now, but also made the point that behaviorist theory is commonly used. Yes, because Jacob Christensen teaches in high school. On page 29 of the book, there are comments about how these two theories are so different from one another. Behaviorism is often something that the instructor decides you need, whereas humanism is learning because you want to learn to improve in some area. And it's not necessarily just self-directed learning, but that the way you learn it kind of emerges. You still may set some certain goals for yourself, but it's done by yourself. So that's one question. And I'll get to that response here in just a minute. And then the second part is, how can we facilitate situations that lead to adults learning just because they want to learn and improve themselves? Now, the second part is about motivation. And several of you asked questions about getting adults to have behavior change or getting them to learn. And when we get to week 4, we talk about motivation, and we'll come back to this. And how do we help them maintain interest over time? So I'm holding that question, but I want to come in here to this idea of these are two confounding things. I don't really see how humanism and behaviorism can come together. And I think after I've talked about the setting enough now, that this is what really the answer is. And it sums up both question 1 and discussion question 2. The most accurate learning theory. The answer is it depends. Content, age of the student, individual differences in a group dynamic, as Jacob Christensen pointed out. I didn't post that, but he was mentioning if he could change what happens in third period over second period. And that's just about the group dynamic of the individuals you have in the group. What's the setting? Is it formal? Is it non-formal? Is it informal? So in a formal setting, we might see more behaviorist kinds of things because there's an expectation of absolutely meeting an outcome or an objective. Whereas non-formal, that may be a bit of a moving target. And in informal, it just kind of happens. And even though it might be more self-directed in a person setting that. Remembering that these inventories are for adults. Remember, it's for adult learning. So a lot of you are applying your experience in the secondary, not the post-secondary world. And many of you were applying it in a formal setting versus for the non-formal that a lot of the dietitian MDA folks posted here. This is the upshot. Learning is a complex behavior. And I really want to make this pitch right now. Don't confuse learning theory with methods or engagement strategies. I could kind of see that. There is a relationship, but it doesn't mean that the strategies are exclusive to a particular type of learning theory. Let me give you an example. Learning theories are about how people think, or how we think people learn. For example, an experiential hands-on activity, it could be taking apart a motor, or it could be a vocabulary game, may work with cognitivism, thinking and processing by association. So for example, if you're taking apart the motor, you're thinking about, as you're taking out the pieces, how do these things work together? I'm doing something very hands-on, but while I'm playing the game, I might also be thinking about how does this word associated with this definition? So the hands-on or experiential type activity, whether it be tearing down an engine or playing a vocabulary game, may both use cognitive learning theory. In other words, thinking about the process or the association. And then in humanism, we might also be saying we're making choices for the way that we're learning this. We're making a choice that we'd rather play a game about the parts of an engine as we are thinking about this. We're making this choice, or we may choose to have hands-on learning. Both are experiential. And then behaviorism, now let's switch here, if you can't weld vertically, you won't earn a certificate, or if you can't put this engine together and make it run, then you won't earn a certificate. So you're still using an experiential hands-on learning activity, but it might be played out in a cognitive way, in a humanist way, in a behaviorist way, depending on what the stakes are in the setting, the student, and the individual differences that you have in the group. So I don't see them as mixed up. I see that you being aware of these learning theories and putting that together in your own mind, and that it will depend, as learning is a complex behavior. Just moving on here, a couple more questions. David Johnson had this question. I feel that I could, for Amy, I feel that I could relate towards certain aspects of all the theories. Do you feel that our own views and personal experiences and exposures guide us toward choosing the learning theory and styles we personally use? Um, I think I don't want to confuse again learning theories and styles. We choose learning approaches based on those settings and the content that we need to deliver and the individuals in the group. And the question then is, do you feel our own views and personal experience exposes guide us toward these? I think oftentimes what we really got to think about is modeling, modeling that if we see that behavior, if we see that learning strategy modeled, whether it's experiential, and then how we connect to that learning, that's how that guides us towards what we're going to do, what was modeled for us on that particular area of content with that particular audience. And I've had other students say, wow, I did something with my high school students or my middle school students, and I tried it with, one of the audience or other, and it didn't work at all. Or I tried something with these adults, and my students, they're middle schoolers, and they don't really understand. They don't have any, self motivation or they don't regulate their learning. And so it totally tanked with my middle school students. Sometimes that happens, and so that's why you try a different approach with that strategy, even though it was modeled for you with that particular audience. Taylor had this comment. Should we as educators focus more on our own philosophy to become better teachers because that is how we learn best? Or should we put more of our effort into developing in all areas? In other words, is it better to focus on using our strengths to teach or focus on their strengths of the learners? Are both possible? Well, this started a conversation in this group about teaching to our strengths. And I think some of you may be aware of a book, and I'll show that in just a moment here. And then in the same discussion then, Taylor, to answer your question, this is from Michelle Klaus, I think that it is important to focus on our strengths. It is important that we feel confident in what we are doing. If we feel confident and excited, then there's a higher chance the students will be excited about the topic and they will learn more. And then Kari also went on this topic and said, I recently had a discussion that revolved around your question. And one of the new ideas that was expressed was to try and focus not on our natural learning styles, which I will get to in week 6. There were a lot of comments in this group about whether they exist or not, or teaching styles, but instead the styles of our weakest, that use our weakest so that we develop them. I am not sure if I totally agree, but it's something to think about as we design curriculum. Personally, I'm all about variety. So she's saying take a different approach, taking different approaches, even if it pulls us out of maybe our comfort zone, is a good idea because that will make us strengthen overall. Well, there was a book written in 2005 from Gallup commissioned some folks, and maybe some of you have seen it. I'll pull it over here. Right here. Teach with Your Strengths. I've read this book and it was okay. I got to about, I would say halfway through it, and it started to me to be a little bit repetitive. But these authors then talk about using and teaching with your strengths. You'll hear from great teachers who reveal their unorthodox and unsure to be controversial approaches. And one of the things that I think those of you who've taken my classes before is I always want to look at the critics of. So even though this book was being touted, it was being used in school districts for professional development. I decided to look at the critics for something like this. So if you go to Amazon, Teach with Your Strengths, then you'll find maybe it would be best for you to go over them and encourage. Ever read this book that insulted every aspect of your being? If not, be sure to pick up this unforgettable paperweight. And then there were some about teaching to your strengths. But for a book that has sold as many copies as it has, I was really surprised that we're this few reviews on it. When you get into that book, there is a link or they give you a code to use a strengths finder. And you go and you take another assessment, and they're saying, what is this? Over 16 million people have done this. You go into the Strengths Finder to determine what your strengths are. Now, going back here to some of the critical reviews, and I always pull them all up to see what they are. Now, some of them are just grousing because their access code didn't work. But this one was interesting. A bunch of hooey. The book claims to help individuals learn to teach with his or her strengths. However, the book shills in the highly questionable teacher insight assessment from Gallup, which may be a contributor to the significantly high rate of teacher turnover that school districts are experiencing. Save your money. The book and the assessment are questionable, are not just questionable, but may be harmful to your intellect and health. So there were a few critics like that. I'm not sure that it was harmful to my intellectual health, but after I took this, after I read the book, got the code, this was, I took this probably 4 years ago, maybe now, 3 years ago. This is what was presented. Deborah Spielmaker's signature themes are achiever, activator, learner, maximizer, and self-assurance. Probably no news for me there as I took that particular Strengths Finder assessment. But when you go here, you can actually either order the book or you can pay to take the assessment. I think it's like 20 bucks. Yep, there it is. 5 top strengths, beyond your 5 top strengths, and all 34 strengths assessed. You can do this, and it'll tell you things like these. These are the strengths. And then it discusses how a teacher, what it does do is it discusses if your strengths are in these particular areas, back to mine, achiever, activator, learner, maximizer, self-assurance. If your signature themes are in this area, then strategies that may work best for you. I'm not sure that was that helpful to me, but since you all bring it up, I thought I'd share that teaching to your strengths, or I think teaching with things that you're confident in, is really important. I mean, nobody wants to stand up there and think like, oh, I really am living outside here, but it's also part of the way we stretch and learn. So I can see an argument for both ideas. I can see the idea of really teaching and feeling comfortable with what we're doing, and also stretching ourselves and making it a little bit diverse, and then deciding, yes, that did or did not work, or how you might need to fix things in the future. This was one of the reasons that I posted this this reading here. It was a website, and it was the site on 25 things skilled learners do differently. And I think this actually is as important as the Strengths Finder. Skilled learners think about their own learning. Skilled learners ask more questions. Skilled learners are process-oriented. Skilled learners can often find the way without guidance. Skilled learners always keep the big picture in mind. Now, I'm not going to go down through all 25 of these because hopefully you did this. But skilled learners using testing to boost their own learning, they cultivate curiosity. This is talking about learning from the learner's perspective, and there was a little bit of research here, and I think most of this will resonate with you in any kind of setting as a learner. But what I want you to think about here is, as you look at this, if these are what skilled learners do differently, how, as an adult in an adult world, and even in a secondary setting, middle school and high school, how can we facilitate what a skilled learner does? If a skilled learner thinks about their own learning, how can we put students in situations where they can do some self-directed learning? If skilled learners ask more questions, how can we encourage or model them to ask more questions? If they are process-oriented, that's the cognitive thing. What kind of strategies? Maybe it's doing concept webs. Can we allow them to express the process or the association by learning? Let me just randomly go down here. Skilled learners appreciate different perspectives. What can we do to facilitate different perspectives? In my mind, this little website right here is probably one of the most helpful resources that we can have. Probably I'm afraid that it'll never go away. I should probably download it as a PDF and save it, because I think that these are the really important concepts when we're taking a look at learning theory. It's really with the learner. If these are what skilled lifelong learners do, how can we bring that, how can we facilitate those types of skills? So that's my comments on the Strengths Finder. And then the last question, and this is a pretty long reflection, but there was some great discussion, and I think, as I mentioned, these reflections, your experience is the adult learner's textbook. Your experiences will really enrich what we read about briefly. I mean, we read about learning theories and really like 10 pages, or each one of them had like a page or page and a half, which actually I liked a lot. They really summed up in your text. But I do want to spend some time with the comments you make, because your experience as adult educators and as adult learners is really helpful as we look at the course outcomes here. So this last question by Kimberly, post 2, considering all 5 learning philosophies, what are some techniques you would include into a lesson plan for adults to meet all 5 philosophies? Please share specific examples. Not necessary. I think now that you can see, we're not talking about putting different strategies for having some sort of experiential activity with more of a cognitive learning activity. It's more, how can I take an experiential activity and get them to go through what we see as positive ways we learn regarding processing, regarding a humanistic approach, and we'll get to the concept of transformational learning and those kinds of things in the semester. But these things don't all have to happen in all 5 philosophies. In fact, I was in a research meeting last week where we talked about abstracts, presenting abstract and concrete kinds of examples for way we teach. And I'll be talking more about that when we get to Kolb and andragogy in that reflection and wrap up. But oftentimes we need to really take things that are abstract and make them concrete depending on the learner. And sometimes we can start with something that's concrete and go to something that's more abstract. And that's something that will fit into more of the teaching techniques, as you call them, for addressing learning theory. But I would also bring back this idea, 25 things skilled learners do differently. If there are ways to incorporate this, some of these types of skills, then I think regardless of the theory that we're working from behind, we're going to have people that can really be lifelong learners, and that's really important to make things relevant to them as adults, which is the goal of this course, is getting you to facilitate them as adult learners. All right, those are my comments for the week. Great posts, everybody. Lots of really lengthy posts in some groups. I appreciated reading about your experiences, and I look forward to our discussion in week 4. There's no discussion in week 3.